Welcome to the Better Together podcast, where we look for ways that we can come together and more effectively serve the body of Christ. Today we have with us Dr. Gary McIntosh. He's the president of the Church Growth Network. He's also a professor of Christian ministry and leadership at the Talbot School of Theology there at Biola University. And he is the author of more than 26 books. Many of them we have around here, and I hope many of these you have on your own bookshelf, because it looks like, Dr. McIntosh, everything you write seems to be a little bit helpful to us.
Thank you very much, Eddie. It's nice to be with you and with all of your listeners and watchers of this podcast. And thank you for buying some of my books.
Hey.
I appreciate that.
Well, and Brad Ransom is like your number one fan, so just remember that. Well, we'll just leave it at that. But he mentioned to me one of the books you've got coming, I think May 2021, The 10 Hats of a Pastor. So that's based on some research that you have done, kind of comparing growing versus declining churches. Can you share with us a bit about that research and what you know about the different hats that pastors wear?
I'll be happy to. I guess it was about 2 years ago, I got to thinking back when I was pastoring and how many hats I used to wear. I remember Sunday morning wearing the preacher's hat or the speaker's hat. And when that was done, I walked down off of the platform. As I'm walking towards the back, somebody came up to me and started talking to me about some relational need they had in their family. And so all of a sudden I had to take the speaker's hat off and put the counselor hat on. It was like just 5-10 minutes, as we often get caught as pastors in the hallway or something. And so I talked to them for a little bit, and then we scheduled another time to get together. And then I went ahead and walked back towards the entrance to the building. And as I got closer back there, I think it was one of the board members came up, and they had a question to do with something about church finances. And all of a sudden I'm taking off the counselor hat and I'm putting on kind of the managerial hat, and so that went on all day. And I was thinking about that 2 years ago, and I counted up that I had worn like 4, 5, 6 hats, within the matter of maybe an hour or 2 hours. It was just crazy. And I got to thinking about this, how pastors wear so many different hats, particularly if you're a solo pastor of a smaller church. You end up doing so many different things, and some things we're trained for, some things we're not, like finances. How many people or how many pastors in Bible school or seminary ever had a course on how to do budgets or financing? And that's a rarity if it's out there.
Yeah.
And yet we're thrown into a church and we're supposed to know how to do a church budget or something. It's like, this is crazy.
Yeah.
So I wanted to write a real practical book. I teach in an academic atmosphere, but I've always been very boots on the ground, very practical. I think that's why some pastors like my books, because they're more usable, I guess, for the normal pastor who's out there, in the thick of things, trying to do things. And so I put together a survey, and I sent it out to pastors to ask them what hats do they wear, and how much time each week do they actually devote to wearing that particular hat. And so I got the results back, and then what I did is I put that together along with some of my practical wisdom from years of ministry and talking to other pastors, and put it together in this book. The publisher has now changed the title, and it's going to be called The 10 Roles, R-O-L-E-S, The 10 Roles of a Pastor.
Mm-hmm.
They're still going to have the hats in the book, but they didn't want to go with that as a title. I don't know why.
Who can know? And they control a lot of bit of that too, don't they?
They do. They do. So it's going to be called the 10 Roles of a Pastor. Yeah.
That's great. So you found out like what the growing churches, the more time that they were spending in certain roles versus maybe churches we might call declining. And I guess you're able to pick up a little bit of what are the most important roles, or maybe are some of the roles or some of the hats maybe a little more important to wear and spend more time wearing or in than others.
Yes, yes. So what I discovered was of the pastors who reported to me, on average, they work 60 hours a week.
Okay.
Which is, that's really not all that much different than, other people who work other jobs. We think of this, the standard job being 40 hours a week. But a lot of people work in jobs where they work, 48 hours a week, or particularly if they own their own business, they work a lot of hours. And I think pastoring's more like owning your own business. Now we know that the church is Jesus Christ's church, and we don't own the church, but pastors kind of relate to a church more like a small business owner would, because, a small business owner goes home at night, they take work with them, and they're concerned about their business. And when we go home as pastors, we just don't shut off the ministry of the church. We take it with us emotionally, mentally. We're thinking about it at 11 o'clock at night. And so one of the things I discovered was it's really difficult for pastors to know how many hours they spend in ministry, because our life and our ministry meshes so much together. It's like fingers coming together, and it's hard for us to separate what is work and what is not work. And it's also hard to separate when we're wearing different hats, because the hats overlap so much. How do we know, the speaker's hat, for instance, that was the number one hat, the preaching hat or the speaking hat. And of course, pastors do a lot of speaking. Mm-hmm. But when we're counseling, is that speaking or is that counseling? Well, we're talking. Pastors talk a lot. That's part of our job. And so it's really difficult for pastors to separate out exactly how many hours that they spend preparing for sermons and Bible studies, and separate that out from, say, a business meeting or a board meeting or a counseling session. And so that was one of the interesting things I found, is it's a pastor's job is really complex. Mm-hmm. It's not easy to tell people what a pastor does all week, because there's these hats overlap so much, and sometimes we got hats piled on hats.
Yeah.
But on average, the pastors reported 60 hours a week that they worked, and the pastors in the growing churches reported that they work about 73 hours a week. Mm-hmm. While pastors in declining churches reported that they worked 48 hours a week. Mm-hmm. So that was a significant difference. And I think clearly pastors in growing churches work more hours. Maybe, you can't say that just because you work more hours, your church will grow. Yeah. But certainly a growing church puts more demands, I think, on a pastor. Mm-hmm. You have more people. You have more meetings, more things you have to do, just in general. And pastors tend to work a lot more. 70 hours a week was the average for pastors in growing churches versus 48 hours as the average for pastors in declining churches. So, right there was a big difference. Yeah. If we're going to have a growing church, we're going to have to work at it.
Yeah. Let's mention one thing about that. You just said like some of these things overlap. And so like, for example, I was a pastor too, and I might be at a restaurant enjoying a meal with my family, but I am kind of involved in the community, and somebody says something, and you're inviting people to church and so forth. So it's not like it's 70 hours of real tough work. You're just kind of always on, if you will. The other thing we talked about earlier before we did the podcast was we don't know about the bivocational part, do we? About which ones of these guys are bivocational and which ones are the full-time. And so that could have a little aspect too, couldn't it?
Yes, yeah. So anytime you do a survey like this, once you've done the survey, you always think later, well, I should have asked that question.
Yeah, yeah.
And once I got all the survey results in, I started looking at it. I got to thinking, well, I forgot to ask the pastors, are you full-time or part-time?
Yes.
And it could be that in some of the declining churches, it could be that some of the pastors are bivocational and maybe they're only putting in 20 hours a week in leading that church. But, we don't know that answer, but I think in general, what my survey showed was that to have a growing church, you do have to work a bit longer than if you just want to have, a church that's declining or plateaued. It's, the pastorate's a funny job. We don't have to punch a time clock. There's nobody at work. When we walk in, there's nobody there with their watch saying, oh, you came in 15 minutes late. So a lot of times the pastorate, you can either work hard or you can hardly work.
Yeah.
So I think perhaps in some churches, the pastors are not working as much as they could, or they're not working, as we say, smart.
Yeah.
It's not always how many hours you work, but are you smart with the hours you work? Are you intentional about what you do? And so I think what the survey showed was that growing churches are more intentional, particularly in four areas, and three are really important, and that is that pastors in growing churches put in more time preparing for the Sunday morning message than pastors in declining churches. Pastors in growing churches actually put in twice as much time preparing for the Sunday morning message than pastors in declining churches. Wow. And so obviously their messages are probably better presented, better quality, maybe connect with the listeners better. Just by virtue of the fact that they put in more effort and time.
And so even if you're a bivocational,
so I think that's crucial.
Yes. And even if you're a bivocational pastor, then you're putting a lot of effort in that speaking role.
Right. Yes. Because, some growing churches are pastored by bivocational pastors.
Yes.
So just because you're bivocational doesn't mean your church won't be growing. But I think the importance of this survey is it shows that that the pastors of growing churches put a priority. Their number one priority is that Sunday morning message. And they put in about, this will be shocking to some people, they put in an average of 10 hours a week in preparing for that sermon. Mm-hmm. Now, I know in some seminaries and Bible schools and in some ministry circles, pastors are encouraged to put in 30 to 40 hours a week into study, and that's just impossible. Mm-hmm. It's just not happening. Unless you got a large church with a large staff, right. And then maybe you can. But on the average pastor is going to put in 10, maybe 15 hours a week, which would be 1 to 2 days of time in preparing for their sermon. But pastors in declining churches put in only half a day a time. So I think that's, if a pastor wants to have a growing church, they're going to have to make sure that they put more effort into that message. A lot of times that's all people know about us. They just come on Sunday morning and that's all they hear. And so, what they hear needs to be pretty decent, if we want them to come back, The second thing that pastors of growing churches do is they put in a lot more time in leadership than the pastors of declining churches do. And it's nearly twice as much also.
Mm-hmm.
But by leadership, what I mean is that the pastors of growing churches spend a lot of time talking about vision. You know, where's the church headed? Where are we going in the next 5 years, the next 10 years? They spend a lot of time talking about the mission of the church, the Great Commission, you know, verses like Acts 1:8, you should be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. And the classic passages of mission and direction for the church that Jesus gave us, the pastors of growing churches spend a lot of time unpacking that and teaching that and, you know, encouraging their people that as a church, we're to be marching forward and growing and reaching people for Christ. And pastors into the declining churches just don't put as much time into those leadership activities of vision casting and building the mission and the sense of mission. Some of your listeners may have seen this on the internet. There's an internet report going around that Barna Research is saying that 51% of people in our churches have never heard the Great Commission. 51% have never heard the Great Commission. Now that's crazy. You know, so the last words that Jesus spoke to us, you know, go and make disciples. And some pastors are not even preaching about that. We can't assume our people today, you know, our people are so biblically illiterate in our churches nowadays. Many of them never having gone to Sunday school, or, you know, so many people don't even know the basic stories of the Bible anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so as pastors, I think in the growing churches, they spend a lot of time talking about who are we? What are we to be doing? What does Christ want us to do? And they cast that vision, and that how it helps move their people towards the future.
That's great.
The third thing that pastors of growing churches do a lot more than the pastors of declining churches is that they coach. They coach.
Yeah.
They come alongside other people and encourage them and give them advice. They don't do the work, but they actually coach them to do the work. And coaching's kind of a new word in church circles. We used to talk about being a church consultant, and now there's a lot of church coaches out there. And the difference is a consultant works with the organizational structure, but a coach works with the person. And pastors of growing churches, they spend a lot of time building their leaders in the church. They work with their key people in the church. And, you know, they try and place people into leadership positions and give them freedom to lead and make mistakes, and then to be there to help them and answer questions later on. Pastors of declining churches tend to do a lot of the work themselves. So a pastor in a declining church will tend to do all the hospital visitation. A pastor in a growing church will tend to try and recruit a team of people and coach them on how to do hospital visitation, and then send them out to do it. And then when they're done, they'll come back and talk to the pastor, and the pastor will say, well, how did it go? And they'll say, well, this happened. And the pastor will say, well, try this next time. So instead of the pastor doing everything, the pastor trains other people and coaches them. Whereas in the declining churches, the pastors tend to try and do it all. That's a big difference.
Yeah, and then from there, it really drops off on the amount of time, doesn't it, that as far as the roles or the hats that's between the growing and declining churches?
Right. Those were the big three. Growing pastors of growing churches spend more time in preparing to speak and teach and preach and to lead and to coach. Mm-hmm. From that point on, things were much more even. Mm-hmm. both pastors of growing and declining churches get involved with managerial aspects, executive aspects, budgets, decision making, planning, things of that nature. Another area, it came in actually lower for both pastors of growing churches and declining churches, but that's the area of evangelism. The evangelism came in down about 6 hours a week for pastors of growing churches and 3 hours a week for pastors of declining churches. But so it was low for both growing churches and declining churches, a focus on evangelism. However, even though it was low, the pastors of growing churches still spent twice as much time in evangelistic efforts than the pastors of the declining churches, 6 hours to 3 hours a week. I don't know exactly where they put all that time, whether it was personal evangelism or training other people for evangelism. My guess would be that in the growing churches, because pastors focus more on coaching, that they're probably trying to help their people get more involved in evangelistic efforts outside the church than just perhaps doing it themselves. But that's a bit of a guess on my part. Yeah. Having talked to pastors a lot, again, pastors of growing churches tend to try and help other people do ministry rather than just doing it themselves. One of the things that surprised me in this study was that this whole emphasis we've had for the last probably decade or so on missional church. Yeah. And missional meaning that the church needs to get involved in the community, in community projects, community relationships, to build a good reputation in the community so that people will be more inclined to listen to what we have to say. There's been a huge emphasis on missional church since probably the late 1990s. So probably a good 20 years. Although some pastors may not have heard about this for maybe the last 10 years or so, but it would surprise me that the hat that came in, the being worn the least, was what I call the reporter's hat. But what that is, it's the hat of a community engagement. So it's like a pastor who might get involved with a Rotary Club, become a member of the Rotary Club, or a church may adopt a public school, right? And love on the teachers, support the teachers. There's a lot of this happening nowadays. Some churches do what they call servant evangelism, where they go in the community and they sweep the street or clean up a city park or paint somebody's house that's dilapidated and the person can't afford to paint it. The church will go in and paint it. Right. A lot of churches are doing this kind of missional engagement in the community, which historically we used to think of as social work, social justice, things like that. And as all of our listeners will know, social justice is a big issue today. Yeah. And a missional church is saying to churches, you need to get out there and get engaged in the community, and to meet your city leaders and and do some good for your community. And I'm for that. I mean, it's a good thing to do. Yeah. But it's the least worn hat. Right. For both growing churches and declining churches, the very least thing they do is get involved in the community as pastors directly. Maybe that'll change in the days ahead, but I just don't think pastors are seeing that as that valuable of a place to put their time, because it's the very bottom. And so that was a bit surprising to me. I thought it would come in a little higher after all the emphasis we've had on this the last few years. Mm-hmm. And I mean, really, it's a picture of what we do know.
kind of the speaker hat, the captain, and the coach hat, or those roles are necessary, it looks like, for growth. And I'm wondering if, it seems like the culture is becoming more secular, and that maybe that particular hat or role may be something we will need to play more as our communities are more secular, to give us a foot into the door with them, perhaps.
Yeah, but I think that's true. I think what my survey was done about a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what it's saying is that pastors are not quite there yet.
Yeah.
They may be reading the books, and they may agree theologically and philosophically that we need to get involved in a community, but they're not doing it yet. And that's because they only have so much time.
Right.
And, pastors constantly are having to choose where to put their time. And there's so much to do in the church. How do we find the time to be outside the church, mm-hmm. engaged with, say, a local public school, right, or something? And so, again, this was a study of where pastors put their time. And it could be that people in the church are investing their time out in the community, which I hope they are.
Yes.
And maybe the pastor's helping them do that. But this was asking, where do you, as a pastor, put your time? And it appears that it came out as 4 hours a week for growing churches, where pastors were spending time in the community, and 3 hours for the non-growing churches, which I guess isn't too bad. Mm-hmm. It's 5% of their time, basically, is outside the church, which I guess that's good. It's, I think back when I was a pastor, I don't think I put 5% of my time in working in the community among secular organizations. I don't think I did. And so I think pastors are beginning to do it.
Yeah,
they're beginning to.
And so there's a lot of hats to wear. They'll have to get the book to learn more about the other hats. There are no bad hats or bad roles, so to speak, but there are roles you just have to make sure you're concentrating on. That's kind of the takeaway.
Right. If a pastor is listening to this and they want their church to grow, I think they have to prioritize their speaking, their leading the church in vision for the future, and setting direction for the future, and then helping coach other people in the church to do ministry. And the pastors themselves have to get into a position of where we're giving away ministry to other people and letting other people do it. So instead of us doing the counseling, is there somebody else in the church who could do counseling? And we could point people who need counseling to those people and let them do the counseling versus us do the counseling. So it's the old battle of setting boundaries around our time, and protecting our time so that we can concentrate on the things that really produce growth and development in the body, the local church. And many things are good. Like, for instance, counseling's good. We need the care for hurting people. There's no doubt about that. But if we care for one hurting person, that isn't necessarily anything that's going to be good for the entire church community. We help that person, and that's good. But how is that helping the church move forward in the future to reach more people for Christ, to make more disciples? If I, as a pastor, could delegate away that counseling to several other people in the church, and that could be their ministry, that would free me up then to focus more on long-range thinking, envisioning what the future of the church would be, coaching other people, building up my leaders in the church. And that's part of what coaching and wearing the captain, I call it the captain's hat, because the captain of a ship points the way. And, Jesus is the chief captain, but we're the under captains. And he expects us to have vision of where the church is going to be in the next 5 or 10 years. And, that takes time to think and to pray and to dream. And if we're caught up in the doing of the ministry all the time, we're too tired to dream.
Right.
Dreaming is a mental, spiritual aspect of our lives. It takes energy. It takes energy. And if we're caught up doing ministry, then we never have time to really think.
Yes.
And I think we need think time. We need think time. We need dream time. And a lot of pastors don't have that time.
Excellent. Well, you can't be swabbing the deck and being on board and pointing the direction of the ship at the same time is kind of what you're saying. And also it's interesting. This is scriptural, as you think about it. This is what the apostles said. We're not going to stop and wait on tables and so forth. We're going to devote ourselves to the word and to prayer. And we see it borne out in this particular research here. Well, thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. McIntosh, for taking the time to do the research, to write the book, and taking the time to be with us today, my friend. I know you have a trip ahead of you to teach a class today, but this is very helpful to us, and we just really appreciate you taking the time to share it with us today.
Well, Eddie, thank you for having me. I love pastors. My whole ministry is about loving and caring for pastors and helping them to be the best they can be with the gifts God has given them. If I can be of a help to your pastors and other church leaders, it's always a joy to be with you.
We will do our best to connect them to you, my friend. And thank you for our listeners today for taking the time to listen. We encourage you to subscribe to the Better Together podcast. If you've not done so already, please share this podcast with others and do what you can to help others grow in the ministry and grow together, because we truly are better together when we work together. Thank you for being with us today.